Page 21, Vittles and Vengeance. I little knew what a big holiday Halloween was in a town like Grandma's. Up in Chicago, we didn't make much of it. A little trick-or-treating in a sheet. Maybe a cardboard jack-o'-lantern from Woolworth's with a candle inside it if your apartment windows faced the street. But that was about the size of it. Down here, it went on for weeks, worse on the weekends. By the time Columbus Day was over, half the privies in town were uprooted and laid flat. One morning we came to school to find a complete old-fashioned buggy up on the bell tower, swinging from an axle. I expected Grandma to be a target. Old people in big houses were. But then Grandma wasn't just any old person. What the Halloweeners didn't know was that Halloween was her favorite holiday. And being mostly boys, they didn't seem to remember this lesson from year to year. The fall was Grandma's favorite season. She liked laying in her supplies for cold weather. As soon as the first hard frost struck her garden, she foraged farther from home. She was like a big, bushy-tailed squirrel in an apron, gathering against the long winter. Halloween fell on a Sunday that year, and there was to be a school party on Saturday night for the entire community. It was a typical school plan to keep us out of mischief. When Grandma heard about it, she said, "If they bob for apples, bring home 2 or 3. We'll bake them with brown sugar." Being 15, I didn't tell Grandma any more about high school than I could help. But she always knew everything anyway. So I showed her a notice from the principal, Mr. Fluke. The grammar in it was good, so Miss Butler must have ghostwritten it. She asked parents to provide party refreshments. In those times, people turned out in droves if there was anything to eat. "Vittles," Grandma said, scanning Miss Butler's appeal. "That'll mean pies." "Gooseberry?" I asked. She was famous for her gooseberry pie. But she waved away. "You didn't make a pie out of canned fruit until the dead of winter, when you didn't have a choice." She spoke of the winter ahead as a war she'd be waging. I must have pictured the two of us in an igloo, spearing fish through the ice. "Pumpkin and pecan," she said, "and we're going to be busy tonight and night and day. Girl, I hope you remember something about rolling out pie crust." We were just finished with supper. Now I slipped away from the table with a crumbling baking powder biscuit in my pocket. Grandma and I have been having a battle about Bootsy. Grandma had never heard of a cat food in a can, and there were precious few table scraps around here. She said cats were natural hunters and Bootsy could find her own meals. Cats are like the burdick, she said. They'd eat anything they could bite. It was true. Bootsy had begun to forget she was a city cat. She settled down in the cob house and was growing sleek and round from a diet of birds and field mice and things I didn't want to think about. But I hated to see her get this independent. Most evenings I'd sneak a treat from my plate out to her. She often waited on the porch with her head cocked. Grandma knew. She had eyes in the back of her head. Tonight, though, Bootsy wasn't on the porch. There I was with a baking powder biscuit coming apart in my pocket. And then I heard a little sound over by the spirea bushes. It was a clunking sound, followed by a small, piteous cry. I hoped it wasn't Bootsy, and I knew it was. I strained to see across the dark yard. 2 green eyes caught the light from the kitchen. I called her, and she came, or tried to. Bootsy bounded forward and then fell back and ran a circle around herself. I was down in the yard now, scooping her up. She clawed my shoulder and quivered. When I lifted her, a nasty old rusted-out tin can was tied tightly to her tail by a length of twine. Though she wasn't allowed in the kitchen, I marched inside, holding her high. "Grandma, look at this!" The can swung below Bootsy, and her tail looked all pinched. "If this is Halloween around here," I said, "I don't like it." Grandma just pursed her lips and took a pair of shears to the twine. "Now turn her out," she said, pointing to the door. Grandma went back to the range to stir something. The kitchen was filling up with a terrible smell. Reluctantly, I spilled Bootsy out onto the back porch. When I turned around, the smell from the pan on the stove was enough to skin my eyes. "Grandma, what is that?" "Glue. The best glue you ever used, better than store-bought. It'll bond wood to wood, metal to metal, and stay stuck till kingdom come." She turned, gasping, from the stove. Her spectacles had steamed up, and her cheeks were wet. "We'll need some picture wire," she nodded to the drawer, "and a hammer. Not the tack hammer, that big one. And there's a railroad spike around here somewhere." I knew not to ask. It was better just to go along with her. By and by, we were trooping off the back porch, bundled up. I wore my plaid coat from last winter, which was short in the sleeves. It was a frosty night, with a ring around the moon. Grandma and I were shadows, casting shadows down her back walk, past her sleeping garden and the clothesline. "Busy, busy, busy," Grandma muttered to herself. "Too much to do." She carried the pan of glue. I carried the rest. The cob house where Bootsy lived stood facing the privy at the end of the back walk. A Japanese lantern vine that grew up over the privy rattled in the night wind. Grandma's privy was among the last left standing. The Halloweeners had struck as near as next door. That privy was just kindling now, scattered, and a plank with 2 holes in it hanging down from the fence. Setting down the smoldering glue, Grandma took the spike out of my hand. With 2 almighty hammer blows, she drove it into the ground beside the cob house door. Winding the wire around the spike, she stretched it tight across the walk to tie it to the trunk of the Japanese lantern vine, about 5 inches off the ground. She was grunting and bent double. "Find us a couple of crates to sit on in there," she nodded to the cob house. "This could take a while." The cob house was where Grandpa Dowdle had stored everything he ever owned. There was just room enough for Grandma and me on our crates, inside by the doorway. The pan of glue cooled at her feet. Bootsy found us. Though she didn't like the glue smell, she sprang onto my lap, nuzzling for the baking powder biscuit. I doled it out to her and held her close to keep my hands warm. It was so quiet you could hear Bootsy chew, and from miles away came the mournful whistle of a freight train. But we were silent as the tomb. Nothing could seem more deserted than this cob house and that privy. At last we heard them, bumbling boys in a bunch making their way past the garden. Oh, how quiet they thought they were being, with their boot heels ringing on the walk and their noisy breathing. I tried to count heads, though it was too dark to see whose. There may have been only 3, though they seemed like more. In my lap, Bootsy was as still as a little statue. Beside me, Grandma was at one with the darkness. We no sooner saw the first boy than the invisible wire caught him on the ankle. He pitched forward, and a word I can't repeat burst out of him. He fell like a tree and measured his full length on the concrete walk. Nothing broke his fall but his nose. There was scrambling. The boys behind him tried to stop, not knowing where their leader had gone. They only wondered for a moment. Grandma lunged. As big as the cob house door, she surged through it. Moonlight struck her snow-white hair, and she looked 8 feet tall. She'd have given a coroner a coronary. As the fallen boy raised his dazed head, she turned the pan of glue over on it. The glue was cool now and would set later. He screamed, of course, and this too panicked the others. They ran into each other and the cob house wall. They tried to get away from Grandma. They must have thought she was a restless spirit. In a way, she was. They gibbered. You'd think they'd cut and run back the way they came, but no, they trampled the fallen boy and hit the back fence running. He came up in a painful crouch and crippled after them. He went over the fence, and his big galooti legs waved in the night air. Then he lit on the other side, again face first from the sound of it. Silence fell. So much had happened in so short a time. Bootsy vanished from my lap. I joined Grandma. A wreath of steam rose from her heavy breathing into the hazy night. The walk was littered with things that seemed to have fallen off the Halloweeners. Grandma bent down and fetched up a knife. She switched it open, and the blade gleamed. By the light of the ringed moon, she read out the initials carved in its handle. There's an A and an F, and a J and an R, she squinted. Do tell. It was the kind of knife a boy likes, and Grandma approved of it too. She closed the blade and stuffed it in her pocket. And looky here. It was a narrow-nosed handsaw, useful for sawing through privy posts, handy to carry. "That costs good money," she said, collecting it. We found a sack, still half full of flour, abandoned by the walk. It was flour for mixing with water to mess on porches and maybe cats. "That'll do for our pies," she said, so I gathered it up. "I'll leave this wire stretched till morning. Watch your step on the way to the house," Grandma said. "I'll be along in a little while." She meant she was going to use her privy, and she spoke with some satisfaction because it was still there to use. At school the next morning, we were short of boys. Of course we'd been short of boys all along, only 6 or 8, and there were 17 of us girls. But even when I counted in both rooms that morning, I only came up with 3, Elmo Leeper and the 2 Johnson brothers. And they weren't town boys. They were country boys, boots and bib overalls. Nobody mentioned the absentees. At least nobody mentioned them to me. But like Grandma herself, I wasn't the first one people ran to with news. Anybody who thinks small towns are friendlier than big cities lives in a big city. Except for Ina Ray Gage, they were all giving me wide berth. The leader of the girls was clearly Carlene Lovejoy, the grain dealer's daughter. She was about as stuck up as she could be in the circumstances. If she bothered to notice me at all, it was to wonder if I'd last. I was still spending my school days on the sidelines. That night, Grandma could hardly get through her chores for her haste. The only hot water we had came from the reservoir in the black iron stove. We dipped water out to do the dishes in 2 pans on the kitchen table, one of suds and one to rinse. She washed, I dried, and she was rushing me. "Grandma, where are we going?" "To pay a call on old man Nyquist." This town was full of people with one foot in the grave, if you asked me. "Grandma, is he real old?" "Old as dirt," she said, "and deaf as an adder." I sighed. "What am I supposed to say to him?" "Nothing, if you're lucky," she replied. So we were up to something. Grandma and I were soon outdoors, bundled against the brisk night. I was pulling a little old red wagon from out of the cob house. You could find just about anything in the cob house. The wagon had been Dad's when he was a boy. Onward we went, kicking through the leaves. We might have been any grandma and her granddaughter out for an evening stroll. But we weren't. We were Grandma Dowdle and me. Old man Nyquist was a farmer retired to town. He lived a street or 2 back from the Wabash tracks in a house on a corner lot. There was a barn behind. Not a light showed on his property. "He goes to bed with the chickens," Grandma remarked, but she looked hard at the house to make sure. "What are we supposed to do, Grandma? Wake him up?" "We're supposed not to." Now we were here in his big yard. Grandma looked up at a tree with a high canopy of foliage. She scanned the ground around it. "The old tightwad," she mumbled. "The old cheapskate." And she must have meant old man Nyquist. "That's a pecan tree," she said. "Them's pecans." She pointed to the ground, but I couldn't see many. But then moonlight doesn't show everything, and a lot of leaves were down. "The old rapscallion said I could have any that had fallen. He knew there wasn't enough for a 6-inch pie. I had an idea he was pulling my leg, the old—" But she was drawing out 2 gunny sacks from the folds of her coat, an old one of Grandpa Dowdle's. "Well, let's get what we can." We bent double and worked the yard. "Be careful what you pick up," Grandma warned. "Not everything in a yard's a pecan. He keeps dogs." It was dim, hard work. It took me forever to find a handful of pecans, and we were picking clean. Grandma was doing no better. She stood and ran a hand down her aching back. Her gaze fell on old man Nyquist's barn. A tractor stood just inside the open door. I guess he used it as a car after he retired to town. Grandma seemed to consider it. She handed her gunny sack to me. Between us, we didn't have enough pecans for a tart. "If someone breaks out," she muttered, "cut and run." I stood rooted to the spot while Grandma drifted toward the barn, keeping the house in her sights. The barn stood in its own shadow. Oil drums and chicken crates and bald tires leaned against it. Grandma stood in the moonlight. She rolled an old tractor tire off the heap. Hitching it under her arm, she advanced on the barn door. The nose of the old Massey Ferguson tractor stuck out. She hung the tire from its radiator cap. I was transfixed. I couldn't think a moment ahead. Now she was half swallowed by the darkness of the barn door, and then swallowed. I stood like a sculpture in the yard. An ear-splitting explosion rocked the night. The tractor roared to life, coughing and gunning. Old Man Nyquist's dog shot out from under the porch, yelping, and chased himself all around the yard. The tractor lurched forward, gathering speed. As it crossed the moonlit yard, there was Grandma up in the tractor seat, white-headed and high. She could start it, but could she stop it? The pecan tree stopped it. Grandma, who didn't know how to drive an automobile, aimed at the tree and hit it dead on, ramming it with the tire over the radiator. The tree reeled in shock and pecans rained. It was a good thing I wasn't standing under it. A ton of pecans fell together like a hailstorm. When the tractor hit bark, it bounced back and the engine died. Grandma's head snapped back, but she was still riding it. Now she was climbing down. She loomed up at me and reached for a gunny sack. "Grandma, did old man Nyquist sleep through that?" "Who knows," she said. "Work fast." We were ankle deep in pecans. "Like shooting fish in a barrel," Grandma said. I scooped him up with one eye on the house. An old codger appearing on the porch with blood in his eyes wouldn't have surprised me. "Keep at it," Grandma said. "He'd light a light first. We'd have a head start." Finally, I had so many pecans I couldn't lift the sack. Somehow we got them into Dad's little red wagon. I was desperate to get away from here. Grandma had to hurry to keep up with me as I yanked the wagon around the corner and down the street. My heart thumped and I wouldn't look back. Old man Nyquist's dog was still yelping. "Grandma, you didn't even put the tractor back in the barn." "Didn't know how to get the thing in reverse," she said. "He'll just think it rolled out of the barn by accident." "With a tire hung on its radiator? Grandma, that wasn't stealing, was it? I mean, in your opinion?" She was dumbfounded. "He said I could have any pecans that fell. And as long as we're out and about, we might as well go ahead and get us some pumpkins." "Oh, Grandma," I said. "Whose?" They were the Pensingers' pumpkins. The Pensingers lived like Grandma in the last house on their street. We couldn't just seem to be strolling past, giving our pecans an airing. The street stopped in front of their house, and from there on it was a cow path and their pumpkin patch. Only one upstairs window showed a light at the Pensingers. I made a note to put a drop of oil on the wagon's squeaky wheels. When we came to the fence line, Grandma paused to take in the view. Behind us, the town was like a little island of sighing trees and rising chimney smoke. Before us, the countryside unfolded, silvered by frost and moonlight. There the pumpkins lolled, gleaming beneath their scrubby foliage. Grandma reached into Grandpa Dowdle's coat and drew forth the Halloweener's knife with the initials in the handle. The blade sprang out and Grandma moved among the pumpkins. She cut free 2 nice big ones and another medium-sized while I stared unblinking at the light in the Pensingers' upstairs window. Grandma moved like a woman half her age and half her size. Somehow she balanced the pumpkins on the wagon among the pecans. I could just barely turn the wheels, but I longed for us to be somewhere else. We were in sight of home when I said, "Grandma, in your opinion, we're taking these pumpkins, We'll leave a pie on their porch," she said, "and don't tip them pecans out of the wagon. We already picked them up once." We barely got everything into the kitchen before she was bustling. The frost was still on those pumpkins when she laid them open with the Halloweener's handsaw. She was soon spooning out the seeds and strings. She'd worn me out, but not herself. She popped the pumpkin parts, shells up into the oven that never cooled. And all the while she recited a little chant underneath her breath. "As much punkin as cream, burnt sugar in a stream, 3 big eggs all beat up, and good corn syrup, about half a cup." She was almost dancing a hornpipe. To her, borrowed pumpkins were far sweeter than bought. Before she could tell me to start picking out the pecans, I stole away to bed. But before the sun of that Saturday morning was up, we were baking. The kitchen was heady heaven of vanilla and cloves and blackstrap molasses. Grandma sifted the Halloweener's flour and worked it with salt and lard so I could roll out the pie crust. And she was particular about how I did it. I never had the rolling pin flour to her satisfaction. And I had to be reminded to roll the dough from the center out, not back and forth, and exactly 1/8 of an inch thick, or I had to start over. I don't know how many pies we baked, and I don't know whose hens all those eggs had come from under. But by nightfall, we had a little red wagon load of the finest pecan pies and pumpkin pies that you ever saw. Grandma had no interest in going down to the school for the Halloween party and said so. I looked forward to it because I expected we'd have the best refreshments of all. "Are you wearing a costume?" Grandma inquired. "Grandma, costumes are for little kids." She hovered. Then she decided to walk me to school for safety's sake. She was wearing her good apron with the rickrack, and I noticed the pheasant feather in her hat, which was dressy for her. I should have known Grandma wouldn't dream of staying home from a party. It was underway, but limping when we got there. Carleen Lovejoy was at one end of the basement in a knot of her confederates. Gawky Gertrude Messerschmidt was one of them, and Mona Veach. Their idea of a party was to stand close and whisper. At the other end of the basement, a grade school teacher was trying to organize Pin the Tail on the Donkey for the little children, who were mostly ghosts and scarecrows. Between there were folding chairs for the grown-ups and old folks, under drooping twists of black and orange crepe paper. Grandma filled the door, and people looked up in alarm and surprise. She was famous for keeping herself to herself, but she was everywhere at once, if you ask me. We parted the party like the Red Sea, bearing in our pies. It was slim pickings on the refreshment table, a few popcorn balls sticking to each other, 2 or 3 plates of fork cookies, a pan of fudge. The school board had provided a punch bowl of soft cider. Grandma cast her eyes over this bounty. "Good thing Effie Wilcox didn't bring her angel food cake," she observed, "or I'd have to needed the handsaw to cut it." She was shucking off Grandpa Dowdle's coat and turning back her sleeves. Of course, she meant to serve her pies herself. It was her moment of glory. We'd been working toward it all along. Miss Butler appeared. She wore black sateen and a matching bow in her hair, which I personally thought was too perky for a teacher. "Why, Mrs. Dowdle," she said, "how nice." Grandma wasn't exactly a member of the PTA. "And what delicious-looking pies." "I'll need a stack of paper plates," Grandma said in reply. Now people were lining up. Miss Butler found paper plates and throwaway forks and 2 knives. Grandma and I began cutting up the pies. She could get more wedges out of a single pie than anyone I ever knew. Mrs. Effie Wilcox was first in line. She was either Grandma's best friend or her worst enemy, depending on the day. And she was an unusual-looking lady, cross-eyed, and her teeth came forth to meet you. "Well, Effie," Grandma said, "pumpkin or pecan?" "Oh, just a sliver of each," Mrs. Wilcox said, looking everywhere. "I'm cutting down." I was shocked at how the grown-ups pushed in first. And then there came Ina Ray Gage, who always looked so wan and drawn that I cut her an extra-wide slice of pecan. When she was past, Grandma muttered to me, "That's the skinniest girl I ever saw. She could rest in the shade of a clothesline." Most of the kids from the high school jostled by. Milton Grider and Forrest Pugh shied past Grandma. Carleen Lovejoy deigned to let me serve her, followed by her simpering group, Gertrude and Irene Stemple and Mona Veach. Our pie supply held out pretty well as half the town trooped past, and then I saw the principal, Mr. August Fluke, bringing up the rear. When he came even with Grandma, he beheld a fearful sight. Slumping in front of Mr. Fluke was Augie, his son. Augie was in high school with us, but you wouldn't have known him. His head had been shaved and his scalp rubbed raw, beginning to scab. His bandaged nose was splayed all over his face. It was August Fluke, Jr. in a sorry state. Sullen, too. My jaw dropped. That skinned-up bald head, that nose. I couldn't stand to look at him. Glancing down, I saw Grandma drop the knife she'd been using on the pies. She drew out of her apron pocket quite another knife, the one she'd found in the back walk by the privy. Somehow she managed to show the initials in its handle as she switched open the blade. She plunged it into a pie and cut August Fluke, Jr. a slice with his own knife. Augie's eyes narrowed. Mr. Fluke spied his son's knife. Then his gaze traveled up to his son's shaved dome. How long, I wondered, had it taken all the Flukes to get the worst of the glue off Augie's head? That was glue that stuck till kingdom come. Into Augie's peeling ear, Mr. Fluke barked, "Boy, you done took on the wrong privy." Augie could see that Grandma meant to keep the knife. She looked past him to his dad, saying, "Punkin or pecan?" To Grandma, Halloween wasn't so much trick or treat as it was Vittles and Vengeance, though she'd have called it justice. As she said later, we fed the multitudes. It was like the loaves and the fishes, with pie for all. After we'd been worked off our feet, one pie eater came back, nosing for a second piece. She was big-boned, full-voiced lady. "Mrs. Dowdle, I declare that's the best pumpkin pie I ever put in my mouth." Grandma could take compliments or leave them. "Who was that lady?" I asked. "Reba Pensinger," she said sidelong. Before the evening was over, we of the younger set, except for Augie, bobbed for apples. I brought home a couple, and Grandma and I baked them with brown sugar.